Hello and welcome to an episode of ReConnect. I'm Kilian Engler, and joining me today is a man who needs no introduction. And for some of our longtime viewers, we are different people, as you can see. Brian Vecchi, our field CTO. Brian, please say hi.
Hi. How you doing, Kilian?
Very good. Thanks, Brian. So today we're going to recap our highly popular Office 365 Connect event from a little bit earlier this year. Brian's going to take us through a little bit of the background at a high level, and then we're going to get to some Q&A that we've received from the audience that we thought would be really useful and impactful to go over again. So, Brian, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kilian. And in this Connect, what we did was walk through a pretty detailed scenario of what happens when you start using Office 365 to collaborate, and specifically when you use Microsoft Teams. We created a team, we added members to it, we added data to the team, we had a private channel, I think. We had people collaborating by sharing links and getting access to things through chat. And then we flipped it around and showed you what was happening on under the hood, and then how you can kind of secure this data and collaborate safely with Varonis. What I'm going to do is do a truncated version of that. I'm not going to go through the whole scenario of creating a team and all of the various people that are in the team and accessing data and sharing data. It would take too long. If you want to see the whole thing, go look at the recording. It was a pretty fun event. But just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, Office 365 we're seeing a pretty rapid acceleration of people using Office 365. We use it extensively here inside Varonis. This presentation that I'm presenting right now is sitting in my OneDrive. And it's easy to see why people use Office 365 so much. It makes collaboration easy. We live in a world now where everybody's working remotely, and you need to be able to get access to any data from any device, anywhere in the world at any time, and give access to other people so that you can work on data and work on documents together. So it makes collaboration really easy. But in the way that it works, what it's doing is it's hiding a lot of the underlying complexity under the hood that's happening. It hides it from users and even hides it from IT. It makes sharing access to data really, really easy, but it makes securing all that data really hard. It can be really hard or almost impossible, especially at scale, with just a little bit of data in 365. Once people start using it, it makes it really difficult to answer basic questions like, who's got access to what and where is sensitive data concentrated? Because of how people can share access to data through collaborating with others by sharing links to documents that they're working on, sensitive data is really often overexposed internally and sometimes externally. And it can be really hard to figure out when somebody starts accessing sensitive data abnormally, especially if their account gets compromised. One of the most common attacks that we're seeing are brute force, MFA bypass, or just good old phishing on 365 mailboxes. Since if you get access to somebody's Office 365 mailbox, you've got access to their OneDrive, you've got access to anything else in anybody else's OneDrive that they have access to, all of the SharePoint Online sites that they have access to. So the attack surface is pretty big. And here's what we mean. Before I dive in, I do want to emphasize, and I do this, I talk a lot about Office 365 with our customers and with prospective customers, with all kinds of folks. And I always want to emphasize, we're not replicating what Microsoft gives you with the security functionality, no matter the licensing level. We're actually a silver partner with Microsoft. We're available on the Azure App Store. We're not in the business of trying to build a better functionality on top of what they give you. What we're doing is, because we have a fundamentally different approach to the data that we're collecting and how we're combining and using it, we're filling some of the gaps that happen from a data protection standpoint. Here's what I mean. Let's think about a traditional file share, because a lot of IT and security folks think about protecting data in using this model, because this is how we've been collaborating when it comes to file systems for 20, 25 years now. Basically what happens is IT will create a shared folder, wherever it might be. Then they create an Active Directory group or a security group, and they put the people who need to have access to that data into that group. Then they add that group to the shared folder. It's pretty straightforward. Basically what you're doing when you're adding people into this group is you're giving them a key to that lockbox. The data in that folder is only accessible to those people. There are a ton of problems with this model, and Varonis as a company was actually created because of that, because there are so many things that can go wrong with this model. You can have folders that are open to domain users or authenticated users or everyone, meaning that the data is exposed to just basically everybody in the company. You can have multiple groups that grant access to the same folder, which can be really hard to manage. And you can have multiple folders accessible to the same group, which means when you put someone in that group, you might not even know what you're giving them access to. But, and here's the key, if you can lock down that folder to just that group, what you can do is just review the people in that group and you've locked things down. Sure, users can take that data and they can email it, they can copy it somewhere else, but the users themselves can't break the security model. If I decide that I want Kilian to have access to some engineering documents that I have access to, I can't go into Active Directory and say, Kilian, you're now in this group. I don't have that access. So once you've locked things down, you've done a pretty good job of ensuring least privilege. 365 creates a whole bunch of new data protection challenges. And a big part of this is that Microsoft's goal is collaboration. They want to make it easy for users to work with each other, to work on the same documents together. And that means that users themselves are the ones doing the sharing. They get to decide. I get to decide as a user who has access to my document. I can share access to this document to anybody in the company that I want. I can share access to individual files. 365 makes it so you can share links to folders in your OneDrive share or SharePoint Online site collections, or entire site collections. And one of the things that not everybody really understands is that Microsoft didn't start from scratch when they created Office 365. They didn't say, I need a data collaboration platform, let's just build one. What they did is they took SharePoint, which has a whole lot of data protection and complexity issues that you have to deal with, and they took Active Directory and they moved them up into Azure and made it all cloud accessible. So you have this environment where everything is a SharePoint site collection. That's going to be a theme as I go through this. Now, as a user, I can not only share files, folders, and site collections, I can share them with individual people. I can share them with groups inside the company. I can share them with guests or external users. I can create links that anybody in the company can use, or I can create links, if you've got it turned on, that anybody in the internet can use. We recommend that you actually disable that. And I can share this from SharePoint or OneDrive. I can share this from Microsoft Teams. I can share them from the applications themselves, either on my workstation, my mobile devices, my personal device, or even a web browser. I can even share it from Windows Explorer because OneDrive is built in and 365 is built into Windows 10. Now, here's the real trick. Because it's all SharePoint, the way people get access to data in SharePoint is a combination of their user, the Active Directory, or in this case, Azure Active Directory groups that they're in, and the SharePoint groups that control permissions to those site collections. And that means if you want to figure out who's got access to what, you have to go to lots of different places, and Teams makes this even more complicated. So Teams isn't a data store. There's no such thing as data stored inside Teams, despite what your users might think as they start to use it. They say, oh, that data's in this team, or it's in Teams. But there's no such thing as data stored in Teams. Teams is just an application that talks to the rest of the Office 365 infrastructure. It talks to Exchange for mailboxes and calendaring. It talks to Azure AD for permissioning. It stores data in both OneDrive and in SharePoint Online. And those of you who really know what I'm talking about will know that OneDrive are just private SharePoint sites. So everything is SharePoint, and Teams is an application built on top of this infrastructure to make it easy to collaborate. All right. Why does Teams add so much more complexity? And this is what we went through in detail in the Connect event. Every time you create a team, what happens is you're actually creating a whole new SharePoint site. In a previous life, I used to have to manage a pretty small SharePoint infrastructure. This was about 20 years ago. And even doing that was really complicated. Now imagine if your users could create their own SharePoint sites. That's what's happening here. Teams creates a new SharePoint site, and in that site are folders. There's a document library for files and emails. That folder has SharePoint permissions, SharePoint groups that contain Azure groups. So there's already a lot of complexity there. Teams also has this notion of channels, and you can create what are called private channels inside the team site. The idea is I'm creating a channel that has a reduced number of people that have access to the data in that channel so that I can collaborate more securely. In order to make that work, what Microsoft did is every time you create a private channel, it actually creates a whole new SharePoint site with its own SharePoint permissions. So now you have an entire new SharePoint infrastructure just for that one private channel, and Teams can have up to 30 private channels. Now, Teams also replaces Skype for Business, which we use for chatting. I have Teams clients on all my devices turned on all the time, and that's how people chat me during the day, or if they need something, right? You can also drop documents into those chats. And what happens is when you drop a document in that chat, it copies it to your OneDrive and then creates links to all the people that are in that chat so they can access that document. And if you close the chat, the document doesn't go away. Long and short of this is, you want to answer a question for one team. Where is all the data stored for this team? You actually have to go to between 1 and 31 SharePoint sites and everybody's OneDrive, which can be a real big problem, right? For every single one of these files and every single folder and all of these different site collections, the way people get access is a combination of what's going on in SharePoint and what's going on in Azure, and Teams is the application on top of it. So if I want to see who has SharePoint permissions, I can go to SharePoint Online, and that'll show me the people that have been granted access through sharing the entire site, which is by design because they're all SharePoint sites. You can do that. It'll also show me the people who have access through shared links, because when you share a link to something, what happens is you're creating a new SharePoint group and putting people into that group. Not a lot of people know that. So every time you click that share button and share it with somebody, you're actually creating a SharePoint group. The trick here, though, is that if you're looking at the SharePoint permissions, you actually don't see the Azure permissions. You don't see the users that are in the Azure Active Directory groups that are contained inside the SharePoint groups. If you go to Azure, you see all those users, but you don't see any of the SharePoint groups or the SharePoint permissions. So to get a complete picture of who's got access to what in Office 365 for a single file, you have to go to two different places. And you have to do that for every single file because people are sharing access to individual files. You have to do that for every single folder because people can create links to individual folders. And you have to do that for every single site collection. That's why this is such a nightmare. That's why it's so hard to make sure that data is properly protected in Office 365. And I'm not even getting into the details of trying to analyze activity and detect threats. The reason that people use Varonis to help with Office 365 are primarily to identify and reduce risk and to detect and more quickly respond to threats. So as you're using 365, one of the things that we're asking people to kind of really think about, and we uncover this during a risk assessment, is do you understand the risk, both on premises and in 365, and how they relate to each other? Do you know who's got access to what? Can you figure out where sensitive data is concentrated? Do you have a team site with a lot of documents that have a ton of PII that are also being exposed to a lot of people? If you can't do those two things, it's really hard to figure out where you're at risk. Where do I even start? How do I understand what changes I need to make sure that my data is properly protected? It's really tough to comply with any regulation that says you need to limit access to just who needs it. The GDPR calls this privacy by design and default. CCPA refers to this as reasonable security controls. You can just think of this as least privilege, need to know, zero trust, whatever framework you want to think about. If your goal is to make sure people don't have access to what, and you can't do any of these things, you can't limit access to just who needs it, you might be failing. From a threat detection standpoint, how do you reduce the attack surface area? One of the most common threats we're seeing right now, again, brute force, multi-factor bypass, or phishing of 365 mailboxes. If any one of your users has access to way too much data, your attack surface is far larger than it needs to be. And would you know if any of those users started accessing especially sensitive data inappropriately? So what we did during the Connect is set up why all these reasons, why all these issues are, why all these things are issues, how it happens in Office 365, and then how you can use Varonis to both reduce risk, measure it, detect, and respond to threats. Kilian, I hope that gives you a pretty good recap of what we did.
That was awesome. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that. Thanks for taking us through that. So the next big part of this is we got a lot of great questions during that session, and we answered a lot of them at the time, but there were some that we did get to, and there were also some just really great ones that I think would be good to share with our audience here on YouTube today. So I'm going to take you through some of these ones. We're going to address them at the high level, and let's get started if you're ready to go. Need a break?
I'm all set. Let's go.
All right, let's go. So one of the biggest ones we got is when creating a team. And we covered this more in the full webinar, but there is an option to create a public team or a private team. Can you help explain to the audience what the difference is between the two? And does one offer more security than the other?
I'll answer the last part first. One offers a tiny bit more security than the other. But the only difference is when you create a public team, it means that anybody in the organization, anybody that authenticates as part of your 365 tenant can search for it and find and join that team. Whereas a private team is only available to the people that are in the team. That doesn't mean that private teams are private at all, because users can share access to the team, to data inside the team with anybody in the company or guests or external users. Team owners can add other members. You can have guests and external users in the team itself. So a private team isn't really private, but it just means that people can't search for it and join it without being invited by the owner.
That's really helpful. Thank you. You touched on this a little bit too, is the concept of a private channel. So can you just recap what a private channel is? Because I think there's some confusion between the public and private teams and then a private channel.
Sure. So when you create a team, there's a standard channel that gets created. It's called general, I think. And you can think about this as kind of it's the place where people are chatting and collaborating. It's kind of an area inside that team. You can then create additional channels. So we might have a marketing channel, and then inside that marketing channel, we might have a marketing team, I should say. And inside that marketing channel have a channel, or a marketing team, a channel specifically for like Connect or the 365 Connect. And this is where, okay, we're not going to, not everybody in the team needs to see this stuff. We're just going to segment this off for specific collaboration. And by default, when you create a channel, it's available to anybody that's in the team. A private channel gives you the ability to say, all right, I'm going to create a channel inside this team, but I want to reduce the number of people that have access to this channel. I basically want to segment off a piece of this team to a smaller set of users. In order to make that work, what happens is under the hood, a new entire SharePoint site is created, because the only way to have a different set of permissions for the data in a separate channel is to have a whole new separate SharePoint site. What that means is a private channel actually has 3 new SharePoint groups that get created that then contain different Azure users. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Pretty interesting. So one of the biggest questions I think our viewers of that asked was, is there a way to limit who can create a new team or prevent users from doing it entirely to kind of help control this from getting out of control?
Yeah, and of course, like anything in Microsoft, these kinds of controls can be set up via policies. You can limit who can create a team. You can make it so that users can't create teams at all. We have a number of customers where IT needs to create the team. What that does, though, is, and you can also limit things like, and I think we're going to talk about this, like you can limit things like what users can actually share. Can they create organizational links? Who can they share to? What clients can you actually run teams on? What clients can you actually open documents on? There's tons of things that you can control from policy. But what happens is the more you limit users' ability to do this, the more you're encouraging them to find alternate means. They're going to find ways around it. If users can't create their own team and there's this onerous process to go to IT and open a ticket, I've got to have them create the team and set things up, and it's back and forth, they're just going to find other ways to collaborate.
Sure.
Similarly, if you limit their ability to share externally or limit their ability to share internally, they're going to find ways around it. So the answer is yes, you can turn some of that stuff off. It's not always successful. We've certainly seen some customers that limit the number of teams, especially during pilots. But what's really interesting is I've talked with a number of companies who were doing Teams pilots, and they had a really small number of teams. And then we did a risk assessment, and they had no idea just how much data was there and how much underlying complexity there was, because users can share access to individual files really easily. So you get all of this data that ends up being exposed in really complex ways, even with a small number of teams and a small amount of data.
Very cool. Another big question that we get and we hear all the time is customers are worried about global access or data going outside of the company. Would blocking external guest access address some of the risk in Office 365?
It does. And there's lots of organizations that have done that, that are blocking guests and external access. And depending on your organization and the kind of data, you might be able to do that. I've also seen customers that started blocking external access, and then their user communities were either finding ways around it because they need to share data with external partners and customers and things like that, or they had to reduce their controls. They had to open things up to specific users or specific teams. So the answer is yes, you can block that kind of sharing, but it actually doesn't solve a lot of the problems that we're talking about, because you can still have data that's exposed internally to too many people. So you can block external sharing. It doesn't solve these problems. Users will find a way around it, and now you have another system that you have to worry about controlling, which may or may not be the right choice. But it doesn't solve at all the problem of internal users having access to too much data and making sure that you know what they're touching and whether that's appropriate, and you can detect if something goes wrong.
Very cool. It just makes me think, everything goes back to Jurassic Park. Life will find a way, and so will sharing.
Sharing and data will find a way. It'll get out there, yeah.
Yes, indeed. Couple questions about Varonis and how we help here too. Couple audience members had asked if they're already auditing, for example, SharePoint Online, and they add Teams, will they automatically capture those events, or is there something extra they have to do?
So if you're a Varonis customer and you're auditing SharePoint Online, so we divvy up our licenses to make it so that you can consume kind of what you need. A lot of what goes on in Teams is in SharePoint Online, but you also need to make sure that you're auditing OneDrive, since of course all of that data that gets put in chat gets stuck in people's OneDrive. And honestly, if you're using Office 365 and you're not auditing OneDrive, you're missing a lot of what's going on. Almost everything tends to happen in OneDrive these days. You also want to make sure that you're auditing Azure Active Directory, since that's going to capture all the authentication traffic and see how people are actually connecting and where they're connecting from. And that'll give you the complete picture, auditing Azure Active Directory, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive.
Awesome. Another question too is...
wait, I finished. And Exchange Online, sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Don't forget Exchange Online, since Teams, of course, talks to Exchange for mailboxes and calendaring. And when you monitor Exchange Online, we've got a lot of threat models that'll help detect things like phishing or phishing attempts before somebody gets access to your data and systems.
And that's a great point too. And I know we've talked a lot about it lately with Emotet and some of the other threats really hammering hard on phishing. So great to point out too. Another thing that we get asked a lot is, as customers are trying to get their arms around this and control access, they often ask if there are ways to report on ownership of teams, the activity, what's shared, and get that to the right people in the business to make decisions around it. Is that something that we can help with?
Yeah, and it's one of the big benefits of having Varonis in place, and that we can do a few things. First of all, we can help you figure out who this data belongs to, because we're going to be monitoring the activity. We keep it for as long as you want, and it makes it really easy to analyze the statistics of that data. You can figure out data owners because you know how data is being used. It's far and away the most accurate way to figure it out. Then with Varonis, you can actually assign an owner and have them get automatic reports about their data. So what we're seeing a lot of customers do is, for the site collections that map to Teams and even the private channels, figure out who the owner is, set them up as an owner, and then you create one report. You say, all right, I want to report about sensitive data use over the last week, or whatever it might be, or whether you have any data that's in there sensitive data that might be being shared externally, that you want to make sure that you understand, like, who's creating these links and who's sharing data. Like, let's correct the business process. So what happens is you create one report, however you want that report to be shown, and then you make it what we call it data driven, where every owner is going to get that report about their data. It is a great step to take to make sure that your users, and especially the owners, the people whose job it is to understand what's going on in Teams, really understand what's going on in Teams.
That's awesome. You brought it up, and we're going to touch on sensitive data in just a minute, but you brought up some of the things and some of the threat models that we have. A question that we get asked all the time is, can Varonis help see what data is maybe being exfiltrated or moved outside of the organization over Teams, or maybe people connected from weird locations? That could be signs of compromise.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's a big question. There's a lot baked in. The answer is yes. So we're going to see all the authentication to Azure. We're going to see access by guests and external users. We'll see the link creation and the link access, which really covers data exfiltration through Office 365. And that's not the only way people can exfiltrate data. You could have a device inside the network that gets owned, and suddenly something is being sent out via Gmail or sent out through post commands, basically HTTP. So Varonis, in addition to just monitoring 365, we're also monitoring the web proxy, we're monitoring DNS, we're monitoring the VPN, we're monitoring all data access on-prem too, CIFS, NFS, SharePoint, and Exchange. We combine all that together. So we can see data exfiltration, and in fact, we'll see the intrusion. We often see reconnaissance. You can use DNS to recon internally on the network, do reverse DNS lookups of entire subnets, find all the machines and devices you might want to go authenticate to. We see things like password sprays. We'll see privilege escalation through techniques like curb roasting. And then we will see data access. We'll see users accessing data that they've never accessed before, especially if it's sensitive. We've got threat models based on that. And then we will see the exfiltration. So focusing on the exfiltration is useful, or starting with the exfiltration is useful, but it's important to understand the entire kill chain. And one of the benefits of having Varonis in place is that we're not signature based. We're not looking for specific signs of a specific attack. What we're doing is we're understanding and learning what's normal for your users, for the data, for the devices themselves, and how they relate to each other, so we can figure out what's abnormal. We, of course, will also detect things like signatures for known ransomware variants and things like that.
Cool. You've mentioned it a couple times, and I'm going to toss you a softball question here, but does Varonis help classify the data?
Varonis does help classify the data. So it's important to understand what you mean by classification. So what Varonis does is we go into the contents of every file, and we use combinations of strings and patterns, like regular expressions, algorithms to validate those regular expressions. We ship with dictionaries of keywords for things like medical terms or indicators that the PII that we're finding might be related to an EU citizen or a California consumer, for instance. So what we're doing is we're automatically scanning every document. We use a scanning engine that traverses both on-prem and Office 365. So what Varonis is doing is we're saying this document is sensitive. Here's why it's sensitive. Here's how much sensitive data is in it. And then we use that as an input into everything else that we do. So we understand who has access to that data, how it's being accessed and by who it belongs to, whether there's any inappropriate access or any potential threat to that data. We can also apply MIP labels, and this is how we relate to Microsoft's classification. So Microsoft's classification is based on the idea of, if a file is sensitive, let's apply a tag to that file. Let's apply a piece of metadata on that file that says this document is non-public or secret or confidential. And then you can have additional controls on top. Like you can make sure that that data is encrypted. You can block it from being sent or shared. You can even have dynamic rights management applied, although that's really tough to do on the file level. What we do is we integrate with MIP, and we work with Microsoft really closely on the SDK. So when we find a file that's sensitive, because we've automatically scanned it, let's apply that label to that file. So then you get the best of both worlds. You can have users applying labels to the documents that they know are sensitive, and you can have Varonis both reading those tags to tell you where that sensitive data is, and then applying tags to data that either doesn't have it or has the wrong tag applied. So there's lots of ways that we relate to data classification. It informs our threat detection and our risk analysis and our prioritization in a lot of different ways. We can classify the data automatically and then help you make sure that it's tagged, because that's what people often mean when they say data classification.
Right. Makes sense. This is another easy one, but we get asked all the time. Can we create custom rules or custom classification criteria? Oh boy, there's some alliteration there.
Yeah.
For people who have non-standard things or unique aspects to their business.
Yeah, the answer is of course. So our classification engine ships with, and the number actually doesn't matter, but it's hundreds of policies, and the policies contain, like if we're looking for PII, for instance, it's going to contain lots of different factors that we're looking for, not just social security numbers. It's going to look for keywords that are proximity matched to a pattern that looks like a social, things like that. You can create your own policies. You can also take our policies and modify them. And most of our customers are going to do that.
Absolutely. You've already touched on it a little bit here, but another one people ask is, we've invested in another classification technology, be it a Titus or Bolden James or even Microsoft MIP. Can Varonis integrate and enhance that?
Absolutely. So if you're using a classification technology that's applying labels to files, like all three that you just mentioned, we can read those files. We can, with MIP, apply the MIP labels to those files. What we can also do is tell you where you've got files that are either not labeled or mislabeled. So if, for instance, you're using one of those technologies, you want to make sure that as much of your data as possible, if not all of your data, is properly labeled and tagged. What Varonis can do, because our scanning engine is so fast and scalable, we can go out and verify that all of those tags are appropriate and identify for, you're probably going to have a lot of data that is not tagged. Make sure that those tags get applied properly.
Cool. I'll address this one head on. You've talked about it a couple times. I think one of the biggest areas of confusion that our customers see, and sometimes even our own people, is how does Varonis compare to the Microsoft built-in tools? Do we compete there? What does that look like? And I just want to make sure that we're 100% clear.
Yeah, it's a good question. It comes up all the time. Why do I need Varonis? I've got, Microsoft provides all these tools, and the answer is we're filling gaps that Microsoft doesn't provide. So if you think about on-prem file systems, one of the hardest things to do with Windows was to make sure that people only had access to what they were supposed to, because you had Active Directory groups that could be applied to folders, and that whole security model got really complicated when folders are open to everybody in the company, or multiple groups granted access to the same folder. With SharePoint, that became even more complex, because you could have SharePoint groups that contained AD groups. So now with 365, you've got SharePoint Online groups that can contain Azure AD groups, and you've now made the entire thing cloud accessible, and you've given users the ability to create their own shares. So what Varonis did is we fundamentally built a technology that was designed to go out to directory services, the data stores themselves, and look at user behavior to help you make sure that people only had access to what they were supposed to. We are combining information from lots of different places, and Microsoft just doesn't do that. That's why we're fundamentally different. There are lots of different security portals inside Office 365, depending on your level of licensing. You can certainly look at different pieces of what Varonis is doing in different places, but there's no central place to see, okay, where am I at risk? There's no central place to see, okay, show me exactly who's got access to this data, or where data is exposed, or what data users have access to. You can't really answer these questions and solve these problems with what Microsoft gives you, which is why they partner with us.
Yep. That's great. So Brian, last question to close us out, and this is going to be a big one. Where can people go to learn more about what we offer and maybe even see this full webinar that we've referenced?
Well, thankfully, we're all on the internet, so you can go to Varonis.com. That's probably a really good place to start. If you want to learn more about Office 365, the Connect event that we've been talking about, this was a public event that we did where we went down into a lot of detail about how permissions and access control and behavior monitoring works in Office 365. That's recorded. I think it's Varonis.com/webinars. I think that's what it is. But if you go to the Varonis.com, you'll see, go to our events page and you can go down to our webinars. You can look at the recording. It was an hour or so. It was a ton of fun. So you can also sign up for our upcoming ones. We've got one right before Halloween that's going to be a ton of fun. We're going to talk about big game ransomware and threat detection. You can also sign up if you want to dive into this in more detail. If you think, all right, this sounds like something that might be useful for us, just sign up for a meeting. There's definitely a place there to see a demo. If you want to see a demonstration of exactly what I'm talking about and how Varonis actually works and what you see and how we can help you fix these problems and how the threat detection works and how the alerting works and where and how we relate to Microsoft, sign up for a demo and I'll get on the phone with you. I'll show you how it works. Very
cool. Thanks. So for this, we can put a link in the description below for the event that we were referencing, the Office 365 event. Just to plug it one more time, we're coming up. I believe it's going to be our last Connect event of the year, talking about big game ransomware. It's going to be spooky. It's on October 30th, I believe. So a little Halloween theme going on there. If you're free, please check it out on the event page. Join in live, ask us some questions. And also, if you're around Varonis' website and you want to learn a little bit more about Office 365 and what we can do, we also offer some great courses like the Office 365 PowerShell course. So we can put a link to that in the description as well. So thank you, Brian. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks for going through this with me, and talk to you again soon.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Take care.